Hello, welcome everybody, and good morning to another Wisdom Exchange live number 21. So, thank you for everybody who's watched the last 20 Wisdom Exchanges. I can't believe we've done 20. Today, we've got a very special Wisdom Exchange. We're going to this time use more of the left hemisphere, more analytical mind to explore our evolutionary journey all the way from DNA to where we are today, going through each of our origins, our ancestors, the species that led up to human beings. How did that happen? What sort of modifications happened all the way up to the agricultural revolution? And if we get some time and if we're lucky, switching over to our right hemisphere, where we're going to talk about how the ancient yogis or the ancient Indians, with their intuition, also tried to contemplate the universe and how they kind of the results they got by contemplating the universe. But we're gonna first start with the well-known scientific view of human evolution. So without further ado, let's jump into the presentation. Actually, before we do that, let's do a quick history about the universe. So over 4 billions of years ago, as you know, billions of years ago, the Big Bang happened, and this released a lot of flux of energy, and it resulted in universal cooling of the universe. And so if you're really interested about gaining perspective of your life, then always go back to the Big Bang and just realize it always started with a bang. So the reason we're doing this today is to gain perspective and of our life and all of life, because it's always nice to gain perspective of why we're here, and then also we can integrate it into our life as well. And it's also just really fun to do. So at the Big Bang, there was an explosion of energy all released, and universal cooling started to occur. So the first atoms that were able to be brought into existence after the subatomic particles came, so like the electrons, the protons, the neutrons, the first atoms were very small, as you know. So the first ones in the periodic table, like 1 and 2, hydrogen and helium, they only contain one or two. These atoms, they only contain one or two. Oh, sorry, these elements only contain one or two atoms, right? So these are very light atoms, and so of course when the universal dust started collating, it started to create stars, and through the fusion in the stars we could create heavier and heavier atoms, right? So the hydrogen helium started fusing and creating elements 3 and 4, and as we go throughout, lithium starts to be created. Then you get things like oxygen and heavier things like iron, and so on and so forth, up to the stage where planets start to get created with their own core, with their magnetic core, and spinning around. If you can imagine, gravity starts to take hold, in the first baby solar systems start to get created, of course. So it's a very, very quick, breakdown in 4 minutes. But what I really want to get to is the Earth and the Earth's conditions in the universe, in the primordial universe, and what was the creations for life, that primordial soup. So as we know, there's lots of chemicals going on in Earth at that time. There's so much unstable environmental conditions, maybe unstable like some of our emotions, but there are unstable conditions in Earth billions of years ago. And at that point, we are seeing a collection of sugars, of acids, of bases being really complex. So not just atoms anymore, but really complex chemicals forming that are made up of a variety of atoms. So you'll have, for example, guanine, cytosine, are some examples, or some sugars as well. But what happened after some time was that through different bonding, like covalent bonding, etc., which is when atoms sort of share electrons with each other and create a field that creates a sort of bond. And it just so happens that I think single-stranded happened first. But anyway, they created this acid structure, and it sort of created this double-stranded helix, this deoxyribonucleic acid. So really, this acid started to get created, which was really, really fundamental 4 billion years ago for our planet Earth. So exactly what forces created these acids and how that came about, I'm not actually sure, but let's just say that in the primordial soup, that these acids sort of got created. And something special about these acids is that they started replicating by themselves. They started self-replicating. They were able to build complex chemical structures. If I move this side, they were able to build complex chemical structures and start replicating. And so we're going to start the story there. So that was like a 7-minute preamble. I hope you're still with me. But they started to replicate. And I'm just going to start to share my screen, because this was the start of something very, very special. So I'm going to share my system audio. Hopefully you can hear some prehistoric music as well, just to set the ambience. So we're going to just start with all our ancestors leading up to us. So remember we talked about the DNA? Well, what happened was that you'll see here this proto-biont structure started to develop. So it was really these sort of, they're not really animals, they're not really kind of cells yet, but they're sort of these complex chemical structures that sort of was made up of these chemicals in this sort of protein mix. So remember, when DNA, from your high school classes, when DNA sort of bundles up, it creates chromosomes, and it creates this loop almost. So they sort of pile up and loop together. And so these are the more complex. So you're no longer just seeing the individual atoms, but you can see this sort of protein developing, this gene structure getting wrapped up, right? Of course, the genes are not really expressing anything yet, but it's getting wrapped up. Then in the protocell, we start to see that, wow, they've sort of created this lipid wall. So for the first time, you've got this organism or cell that has an environmental condition on the inside and the rest of the universe, right? So this lipid wall, this fat wall, is able to create certain conditions on the inside of the cell and certain conditions on the outside of the cell. What does that mean? That the unique conditions can start to develop outside of the universe, inside the cell. So you can start to see here on the inside that you really start to get some complex structures forming in a universe of their own. I'm sorry, that just passed to last time's wisdom exchange, circadian rhythm. But we won't jump to the modern human yet. So, yes, so prokaryotes. Now, obviously, over evolution, we know that DNA mutates. We're going to get certain, now that they're replicating and creating these lipid cells, and you're getting all these sort of factories start to get created, these factories of replicating, creating different components inside of a cell, sort of like a car factory. You're going to start to see more and more complex universes being created inside the cell. And a prokaryote is sort of a more complex version now of this cell, and this prokaryote is sort of still found nowadays in certain bacteria, etc. But you're gonna see this more complex cell wall structure, more complex internal mechanisms operating to the point where we're going to get a eukaryote. And eukaryotes are really interesting because, as you can see, it's not just scattered different, for example, internal structures and sort of just randomly creating things, but now through the process of evolution, how are things surviving, right? How are things replicate? The more quickly it's going to replicate, the more quickly it's able to produce more of itself, right? It's sort of started to split itself. So not just the DNA splitting, but the actual cell is able to split. That's cool. And so the eukaryote has sort of now developed this now really inner universe, inner solar system almost, where you got your big cell nucleus almost, your cell factories, your ribosomes, and now the DNA sort of disappeared into the deeper structures, creating these more mega structures that are really creating the internals of the cell. And for the first time ever, these things are able to move. They've developed flagellae or flagella that are able to move. And you can see that little thing with the center of the nucleus, with the eye, it's not really an eye, it's just a center. So that's cool. That from the DNA, they've started to create certain substructures. Oh, I'm going to sneeze. Oh, is it coming? Oh, sorry about that, but it's live, so you're going to get that. Lots of viruses blasting everywhere. And a perfect transition into blastellae, where we're going to get more flagellae. Now they're able to push faster, push further into different directions. You see a lot of uniform pattern. And now the internal complicated structure has sort of gone away from view. And we can see that this structure, not just internally, but now externally, there have been developing. So these little hairs or flagellae are actually composed of complex structures now we can start seeing. So we've now differentiated from DNA to these protobionts to now really serving different functions within this blastellae. So really this sort of intelligence has started to develop, which is really cool to see. And we've sort of seen this now more streamlined version, so it's now adapting to its environment. It's not just uniform, but it's now the inner universe has now started to adapt to the outer universe in terms of a physical structure, streamline. And that's important as we go on. So, there's more details here, but I assume that they are starting to say that the complex cell wall has started to develop to allow ion exchange, so exchange on the outside and inside of elements like sodium, potassium, I guess, in order to have that action potential. Because as you know, from cell walls and the environmental conditions inside the cell and outside the cell are different, and they create action potential, so a positive or negative charge difference, which can actually help in diffusion of the chemicals inside and outside the cell. So that's also very important to note, that is quite intelligent, because it's using sort of action potentials of kind of like diffusion gradients to move certain ions and elements inside and outside the cell. Now, I don't know why we've skipped all the way to a fish. 7, sorry. Yeah, I knew there was something in between that and a fish. So a worm, a coelomate worm. Wow. You see the difference? It just sort of started expanding into this sort of worm. So it's like from a sort of weird cell living thing into a worm. So it's like, now it's like kind of the difference between bacteria and viruses into like really sort of an animal thing. And of course, in order to find food or nutrients, that, let's call it animal, start calling it animal now, has developed these specialized cells that are able, like light detectors. When your street lamp turns on, it detects light at a certain level of day and it turns on. So these primordial beings were able to detect the photons, and from the photons, it's like, I need to move here into light or darkness. It's not so complex, just light or darkness, right? And so these photons start to develop, and so you can see at the front, sort of the head developing, and from the back more for the movement, right? And as these generations progress, we can start to see that the ones who are got more nerve, so the nerve cells start to develop. Nerve is another type of cell that started to develop, which means that it was producing action potentials and to produce kinetic movement, right? So it's a more complex structure of these flagellae, but they're inside the body, so it's starting to move like this rather than just on the outside. So this is also a very interesting biological differentiation that occurred. Now, coming into this worm, we can see that the light sensor, just like a camera, has started to become more sensitive. So maybe it started not to just develop light, understand light, but really develop or associate, maybe could be colors, wavelengths of light. So as you know, colors are just wavelengths, different frequencies happening. So really that light coming to be is really being able to detect these wavelengths. These nerve cells over generations now, the ones who've had quicker movement are able to survive more, able to get more nutrients during their lifetime and produce more of themselves. So really we're seeing this worm produce into a greater worm called a diplurilla or early deuterostome. And you can see this becoming more elongated, the muscles becoming more stronger. You're seeing now these small cells, these things are now made up of so many types of cells now, and all of these cells have started to differentiate. Now these cells perform different functions, and now the focus is really on what are we creating the functions for. We're creating, the head now for the seeing part. We are moving different internal systems to the internal core, and we're producing really strong muscles for movement and really creating this muscle system. And we can see here that the muscle system is further developing. This muscle system is developing for movement, really the strength. So real pushing, exerting their self into the external environment to really move. And we see this now at a time, I'm sure these are our direct ancestors, but I'm sure now we've started to split into more and more types. So depending on the niche, depending on the environment they are, there's going to be a multitude of developments here. So some may develop muscles here or elsewhere, etc. And this is, remember, we're looking at just this different types of evolution. So the convergent versus the divergent evolution. So these things are going to be diverging, but also some animals may be developing their eye features later on, where that they may need to develop light sensors, but they might develop their light sensors or their eyes in a different way, and that's called convergent evolution. Whereas divergent is if we're diverging paths. So we're starting to see the basal vertebrae develop, so sort of stronger structures now. You can see this whole muscle developing for the first time bone, right? So we were like very fluid before, from these DNA structures, they were making these proteins. But now, with these minerals being able to come in from the universal environment, from the primordial soup, they're able to now structure more and more for this organism to progress in its environment, and it's able to create stronger minerals such as basal vertebra, which is very important because now this we can recognize it as today's fish, or similar to today's fish. So we can really see this eye, we can really see this tail developing, and all these special structures, and we can start to see it with our human eye, right? Of course, we could see the things before, but now we can start to see the different functions, and we start to see our first animal all the way from this protobiont. And of course, these proteins are developing in different ways inside the animal. And so these animals, I guess, are not just splitting, but they're now able to produce eggs and the reproductive system, etc. So these things were splitting in the past, but now these animals have created a reproductive system. So I'm sure the reproductive system must have, like this obviously didn't have a reproductive system, but I'm sure these worms did. So I don't think this had a reproductive system, but yeah. So in terms of just replicating versus, another animal being able to be spawned outside of you, that's super interesting. And so we're just going to progress here with very quickly with now you can just see evolution's going fast. The jaw is starting to develop. External, so we had internal bony structures, external bony structures are being developed. We are now getting specialized fins. We're now getting the specialized streamlined versions of us. So these can not just take in nutrients, but probably eat other animals and other beings. We're now developing a sort of brain structure more, before we had like this, maybe they were connecting with the eye in order to sense, where should I go? But now we are seeing much more intelligence developing, much more instinct developing, maybe gathering sensory data, and that developing even further to the point where we're now getting sensory data to move towards targets, from these generations, moving towards targets with speed, memorizing things, and really like like a complex animal. So we'll leave the internal structures for now, and we'll just focus on what's happening. So we can see that during the evolution of the Earth, that the fish and the amphibians, right, from really the worm to the fish, and from the fish structures to the amphibians. So we know that fish laid eggs, but as land dwellers, oxygen came into more play, not just from the gills, but now having to come away from the water and have water. So maybe these early ones flipped up on land, but they had to go back to the sea. And first they were going to the land maybe for, their gills were like half sea, half land. And maybe they were spawning their eggs on the land and going back to the sea. And then their eggs started to develop, where eggs are a genius structure where your own spawn are able to start to develop inside that egg, right? And then crack open. But over evolution, that egg was able to have a harder and harder shell. And now, eventually, these organisms are able just to withstand the external land environment with, inside the egg, and are able to crack open and develop the first fishapod. So maybe they had to go into the water. Maybe they also had to live on the land, but then the first land tetrapods were starting to develop. So with the emergence of the land dwellers, we can start to see this circadian system start to develop, right? Pumping oxygen through the body. And from then, you'll see the different systems start to develop. The reptiles coming with their different types of legs, with their bony structures, amazing, able to adapt to their niches, eating plants, eating leaves. The first plants also occurring. We can see the earth at that time now becoming more and more green, and the amphibians and now reptiles able to adapt to that niche and being able to extract the nutrients from the environment. Now, we are going from the reptiles, number 18, to this weird sort of reptile, long mouse reptile, basal animal. So you can see this jaw starting to develop, right? It being much more shrewd here with a long tail, sort of developing into a paleocosaur. So I don't know how to explain it, but it's really interesting how this jaw is starting to develop from this fish design into this more land-dwelling design. Quite interesting. Into this more upright creature, therapsid, and it's sort of like a dinosaurish character. Not like its early amphibian reptile, but definitely a more complex reptile. And you can see that head structure developing, this hip developing for a more faster run, for a more agile feet. And into this bigger, start to develop this mammal structure. So you can see at this time, I think this was the late Cretaceous period, you can see that these muscles are starting to develop. These hairs, for the first time, hairs on sort of animals. Hairs are very complex. They're very sensitive to the environment. They're very, they pick up on a lot of things. They're able to keep the animal warm-blooded. So really interesting evolution starting to develop all the way to the small rodent. So we're going a bit quicker through these now. So from that really rodent, shrewd character, you can see this reproductive system developing further, the brain capacity developing further, these paws and hands starting to develop up to the point where they can start to climb trees into this tree shrew, into this promisium. And this is where it starts to get interesting. So we've come away from the reptile sort of little mammals into this more complex mammal structure, where they're really taking up into the trees. They're really forming a habitat in the trees of these sort of primates. And you can see the primates just developing further and further and further with their hands, with their tails. And really interesting, the first hominoid species. Really cool, right? Because you can start to see this interesting intelligence developing. And from here to here, this hominoid to this hominid, tree-dwelling hominid, you can see the complex hands starting to develop, bipedal hominin. So that's really interesting. One of the first bipedal, apart from obviously birds and things, but bipedalism, becoming upright, becoming a social species, all the way from the Australopithecine. And then primitive human, of course, when we started to discover fire, we started becoming modern human with our tools and skill sets. So let's delve into that a bit more. if you're interested into our ancestors. So you'll see this homino. So we just left off there on that last branch. You'll see this hominoidea branch and branching out into really interesting structures and seeing all the way developing. You'll see these like pongo or hylobates or hulok. If you Google these things, they're quite interesting, like little monkey guys who came from our ancestors, but in a different way. But we all developed from this hominoidea species, and these guys developed this way. But this was sort of in this Tanzania that we looked at in Wisdom Exchange 1 in that crater. And sort of you're seeing this development of our species going farther and farther up. Again, converging again between hominin and pongine. You can Google that as well, which is slightly even closer to us. But then you can see that hominin species, right? These guys died out. And then you can start to see how the gorilla, they're even closer to us. And then the hominin species. But then how farther we are, this hominini, pan, again, diverged slightly. But then this is very interesting because up to this point, we do not have any other living ancestors. This blue zone and the light blue zone. The blue zone, everybody else died out apart from us. And the light blue zone, this Homo species, there are a bunch of humans as well. But again, Homo sapiens, the last one standing. So let's have a little bit of a deeper look into the skull set of that. So if you remember the Australopithecus, so like 4 million years ago, look at the skull. Oopsies. Look at the skull shape. $3 million. The skull shape, the teeth developing in an environment, the skull shape developing, and all of these humans existing at the same time. I think somewhere in Africa, and then they're also able to migrate. So all of these humans existing about, 4 million years ago dying out, 3 million, 2 million years ago. I say humans, really hominid or hominin species. Different variations of them. But then that light blue portion that we saw, really interesting because these are not just sort of animals anymore. They're developing this sort of intelligence, and they're a social species. So they are all developing tool sets. They're sort of developing like Homo florensis in Indonesia. They're developing this tribal setting, Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis. So if you Google these sort of species, really interesting, similar skull shapes. So they are humans. They're humans, hominin species. They're walking about. They're interacting, but alas, they never made it to present day. Even the Homo Neanderthal, right? Less than 500,000 years ago. That's not so far. They existed before us as well, and they did die out, whether that be due to niche or us out competing them, or who knows. I think it's still up to debate. But from that journey, from that first DNA primordial soup, all the way to our Homo species, Homo sapien species, you can see that. Wow, what a development. Really a journey that we've been on as a species. And someone on Reddit modeled these characters, I believe, where you can see how over millions of years you can see in their eyes that consciousness sort of developing, that awareness, and that uncanniness about how they started just to, their hair and their facial structures and their adaptation to their environment, where they become self-aware of themselves. Um, that consciousness really developing, and that guy has sort of like the same hairstyle as me. Maybe I'm the evolved version of this guy. Who knows? And then, as we know, that now in that gorge that we looked at our Wisdom Exchange 1, now we're at Wisdom Exchange 21, 20 Wisdom Exchanges later, we are coming out from that gorge, and we are now starting to see these remains, right? So humans settling, of course, but then also having a single wave like the blue line, single wave dispersal, the red line, multiple waves going. So we can see waves going through India, coming all the way through to Australia and New Zealand being settled, I think, well, it doesn't show here, but really being settled quite recently in terms of human Homo sapiens being around. And then in the New World, obviously, the bridge towards the New World and going all the way down to Chile and Argentina. And then the human variation occurring. So if you'll know, like the skin color, the nose as well. I think I remember Googling about the nose, like when it being short and flat, humans in the more humid or hot countries not needing a longer nose, and in the more colder and dry climates, the longer nose being able to take air up, circulate that air, make it moist and warm, and then being able to bring it in. So even small adaptations like that starting to occur. So humans at that point, because we started to become a social species, tribal species, developing fire, weapons, tool sets, we could start to just like the cell before, creating an internal environment, an inner universe with culture and with our own tool sets. We're able to create an inner environment, like I am in a room today, my own cell, and we started to morph our environment, our own cell. We started to morph to our own universe, as it were. So, humans starting to adapt their environment. And, after we became hunter-gatherer species, really the next stage was to settle. And as we see that across the earth, but really in this Europe meeting Asia meeting Africa, in the Levant region, this fertile crescent, so between Sinai, Anatolia, the Zagros, in the middle of that is Mesopotamia. And you might have heard of Mesopotamia, really one of the ancient civilizations in the world. And so here we're getting the first settlers, I think after the Younger Dryas period. So that we're in the Holocene epoch of the human timeline. I think the Younger Dryas related to when the something to do with the glaciers, I believe, but that basically caused humans to start to settle in these regions, and from it became much more viable from hunter-gatherers rather than being full-time hunter-gatherers to be sort of part-time and sort of plant crops, plant species, domesticate animals, so animal husbandry, and develop this wild cereals and start to plant seeds. And what happens is when you start to plant cereals and plant seeds and domesticate animals, you start to become semi-sedentary. And so instead of being a nomadic lifestyle, you start to develop, you start to become reliable on grains and your produce. And so if you start to become reliable on them, you have to cultivate them year on year, because if you don't cultivate them and put effort into them, then you're sort of screwed, because what happens if the season doesn't turn out good? So this sort of synergy happened where the humans were relying on the crops, and the crops started to being cultivated better for the humans, and so the humans started to rely more on the crops, and so we had this dependency, and so we started to base our structures and societies on this sedentary lifestyle, where we started to now develop these with more a bigger complex society starting to develop. We had to establish law and order. How are we exchanging resources? How are we developing a society? How are we creating a stable society? Because societies would crumble if they're not stable. So that requires a form of legislation, a form of trade, a form of now evolution and diversification in terms of human skill sets. So we saw the cells having to diversify, but now the humans having to have fulfill different niches in the society in order to make it stable. And from then, the societies just started to become bigger and bigger. The cities started to become bigger and bigger. The belief systems and the cultures started to become more and more complex. And so the technology could become complex. So we had culture revolutions and technological revolutions as well. And so a fundamental starting point of that was because of the agricultural revolution. So and then from then on we can start to see the evolution of that. So that was really from the evolution of the DNA all the way up to the cultural revolutions of humans and after agriculture. So I hope you really enjoyed that history kind of the universe and of the world. So moving away from the analytical perspective, from the scientific perspective, using our more left hemisphere, as it were, like Ian McGilchrist says in his book, we're now going to look at after these agricultural revolutions, what humans were doing in India, in the subcontinent, thousands of years ago, at the point of starting to write things down. So this is, let's say, about 5,000 years ago, 6,000 years ago. So the agricultural revolutions happened, and thousands of years after that, we're now getting the point of documenting oral traditions. And so for really thousands of years, what have the humans in the subcontinent started to do? And in order to answer that question, we're going to stop sharing the screen. Sorry. We're going to stop sharing the screen so you can see my beautiful face. So what have humans started to do at that point? You know, maybe they have some time on their hands. They've started to contemplate their universe and their surroundings. And so we've gone through with the scientific perspective, but like we talked before with these different models, humans, intuitive models, humans like the ancient humans across all cultures, but we're going to stick with the subcontinent, started to contemplate, they started to go inside, they started to watch their nature of their own thoughts. They started to watch the nature of really the universe, how the nature flowed, and they started to draw intuitive patterns of the universe and the human self, not seeing the human as separate, but starting to see the human as also an organism within the universe. And we see by this journey that the human is an organism of the universe. And so they really start, without this knowledge, of course, that we have, they started to have a level of detachment and just watch the nature of their thoughts, the nature of their bodies, the nature of things happening, whether it be the seasons, whether it be things growing or social dynamics happening, just having a detached view of everything and able to develop a holistic understanding. And so we'll delve into this holistic understanding using our right brain a bit more in this section. So if you're familiar with IFS, internal family systems, and if you've read the book I'm currently reading, Greater Than the Sum of Our Parts by Dr. Richard Schwartz, you'll see that in the 1980s, he's developed this very robust psychological system in that the human ego or parts can undergo burdens. And in order to unburden these parts, you'll have this self, a part of human being, and they're able to basically unburden the different parts. So there will be different thoughts, accumulation of thoughts and thought beliefs that are more critical in nature, or maybe more anxious, or maybe are more avoidant. And these parts are little psychological beings inside, and they interact with each other in different ways. And so everybody has parts. And so we also create interactions with everybody else's parts. And so this is also not just viewing the brain from a very reductionist standpoint, from outside in, but now using this intuitive model of looking at our own thought patterns and beliefs inside. And so that's what we're trying to look at with the ancient belief systems. So now we're going into this more evolution journey of seeing our own thought patterns and belief systems. And so we're going to start with these, the people who contemplated, so like the ancient people from the subcontinent. And so if you're an anthropologist or socioanthropology, study of socioanthropology, you'll notice that this is a study of the human culture and the humans as animals, really, maybe a religion or rituals. And my understanding that they see spirituality, etc., as a social, and religion as sort of a social belief and a social fabric. And so we're going to understand that, because that's sort of the next evolution of where the humans are going up to this point after agriculture, to create their complex societies. But from my understanding of reading into this, into different literature and intuitive understandings, is that humans have created this sort of culture, the spiritual culture on the outside. So these different beliefs or mythologies or stories and symbolisms and archetypes on the outside to tell a certain story going on in the inside. So through all the cultures, the path of the mind is the same on the inside, but the story, the symbolism, the patterns of the clothes, the things they wear, the languages they talk are all different, but the same, let's say, the same intuitive models are happening on the inside, right? So now we know with IFS, scientifically, that how these parts inside of us work, and how these certain parts can relate to certain gods or mythologies. So we can see that the ancient humans had a certain degree of intelligence, of understanding the internal world, and they evolved through the culture to understand this more and more complicated. But we just, in the modern times, have forgotten to understand mythology. And so to understand how this works, not from outside in, but really inside in, is we're going to look at this ancient system. So I invite you to have a degree of openness in trying to understand these more intuitive models. And even if you don't agree with these intuitive models, I'm still a bit skeptical, to understand with a bit of interest. So from my understanding, we're going to stick with just the subcontinent traditions. From my understanding, these have been passed down their oral traditions, again, with these ancient people contemplating, watching the nature of the thoughts and the nature of the mind, what they call the manas. And by watching the nature of the mind, by watching the nature of their bodies, and by watching of the nature of the universe, they were able to distill intuitively certain patterns. And so you'll see there's this yogi guy that's saying Om, but notice that he's not really looking at anything externally. He's noticing the patterns of his mind. And when he opens his eyes, he labels, this is the language, he labels this world, the movement of the particles in the world, very detached view, like almost a scientific view, but he's labeling the detached particles of the world and he's calling this Maya. And so he's looking at intuitively the nature of his mind, the nature of the Maya of the world, and he distills three intuitive forces. Again, the human being is an organism, the mind being a sort of organism, the world being an organism. He can distill certain forces. One force being very doing in nature, um, called rajas. Another force, a third force, being very being in nature, just being in nature, and that being called sattva. And another force that is more tends towards inertia in nature, and that's called sattva. And so he's being able to distill these three intuitive forces in nature. And so that's really interesting because these oral traditions and these ways of viewing the world started to be taken down in text. And I believe there's two texts from the ancient world that Ayurveda looks on. And they're being able to see, and so going back to IFS, when the parts are being unburdened in a client, they're being able to revert to their natural normal states. And so this energetic movement, Richard Schwartz, Dr. Richard Schwartz, talks about being a self energy, so being a self correcting, and he sort of drops parallels between the ancient wisdom of prana, it's called, or chi, which is called this life energy almost. And this, so I know it sounds a bit weird, but this intuitive way of looking at the world is very interesting, from these ancient wise people who are able to contemplate. And so in modern times, or sorry, in these more modern times, with this prana, you're able to they're able to look at the prana or the life in different foods and different humans. So they're able to see this human is operating in this sort of prakriti, it's called, energy. So so certain humans, they've saw different intuitive patterns. So this human has a certain prakriti, and this human has a certain prakriti. And they were able, so it's an ancient form of personality almost, or the way their body's acting. And based on how their body's acting, they're able to see certain ailments that could be caused. So a certain person with high prakriti, for example, vata, would be more likely to have immune systems disorder, and certain person at the kapha prakriti, for example, or dosha, that was more associated with diabetes. So they're able to intuitively understand these certain universal qualities or intuitive energies, and they're able to see them flow into not just humans but also life. And so they were able to see this prakriti or prana energy in different foods as well. So they could say that these certain foods would work well with these people better, or and these environments and these seasons would be better for these. So they were able to draw intuitive parallels. Well, actually works very well nowadays as well for people. So I also wanted to show you this really cool scientific paper. If you're not familiar with Myers-Briggs test, this also works on the assumption that humans have different are among different personality spectrums, and their brain are flowing in different ways to process the world, to input the world, process the world, and output the world in different ways. And this is developed by Carl Jung, a Western psychologist in the early 1900s, and some researchers aligned the different personality types with these different prakutis. So this is really interesting from this medical Ayurveda medical journal that they tested for over 300 volunteers. So if you're familiar, sattva is again the energy we talked about, raja more doing energy, and tamas. So if you know your ENTJ stereotypes, that they're supposed to be very dominant, they're quite good leaders in a workplace setting. Example: Steve Jobs, Napoleon Bonaparte, and that correlates very well with that rajas energy, that rajas. And INFJs are complementary to, they're normally more reserved private people, but they have a lot of insight, a lot of being energy, and they're tapped into that mystical understanding. And so they are the highest in sattva, etc. And your INTPs, you'll know that they're often very philosophical, but maybe a bit more on their head, tending to more that tamas energy. So I know people tend to a bit of pseudoscience, but going to this more, tapping into this more intuitive understanding of this world, of that the ancient people used to close their eyes, watch the nature of their mind, of their thoughts, watch the nature of reality occurring, distilling it down into more intuitive energies of the world. So, not labeling it through more evidence based, but from a more intuitive place. And then watching how these energies and patterns flow, they're able to develop highly complex intuitive systems of the world versus highly complex logical and rational systems of the world. And when you integrate them together, you sort of get this holistic, but at the same time practical view of the world. And so, like Ian McGilchrist said, in terms of stroke patients, when stroke patients with the left hemisphere was damaged, so they were operating from the right, they were seeing the world in a more holistic, poetic view. But when they had their other hemisphere damaged and they were using their left hemisphere more, they were having a more black and white picture of reality. And so I believe that we can both use the journey we discussed first of the more practical Darwinian models, and then using an anthropological view to study human culture and humans as animals. And then now we got to the stage where we're able to watch their own patterns in our mind and have an intuitive understanding. So, not using our mind to map the world, but being able to sit behind the thoughts and have a more perceptive and holistic understanding of the world and draw intuitive patterns of the world. That's a bit harder to document with the evidence base, and then being able to merge the two. I think based on Ian McGilchrist's work and how the two hemispheres see reality, I think we can develop models like this to see reality a bit clearer in that. So that was 1 full hour, almost exactly, about your evolutionary journey from really universe of that particle all the way to watching our own complex thoughts and movements, and really the animal and the universe of our own thoughts themselves. So everybody, that was Wisdom Exchange 21. We went scientific, we went woo-woo, we went through that, very creatively, very exploratively. And whether you believe in some aspects or not, that's totally cool. I'm still exploring, but I hope that was fun for you. If you worked through the whole hour, props to you. But I will end it here now. I wish everybody a fantastic day ahead, and looking forward to seeing all you guys in the next Wisdom Exchange. Thank you so much, everybody, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.